Mhm. Good evening, everybody. We're going to give it just a minute to see who else joins us tonight, but thanks for being here, and we'll get started in a few minutes. Thanks, everyone, again, just for people who are joining. We're just giving it another minute or two since it's an evening for people to trickle in. So thanks for being here, and we'll get started in 1 minute. Okay, it's 5:32. I'm Jane Lazorchek. I lead the Climate Action Office within the Secretary's Office of the Agency of Natural Resources. Thanks for making the time to be with us tonight to talk about an exciting opportunity and the work that we're doing in our office to build towards measuring and assessing progress around Vermont's climate action. I'm going to turn it over to Kessel, who's going to walk us through the Zoom etiquette for tonight and then lead you through some introductory slides before turning it over to ERG, the team at Eastern Research Group, our contractor, to talk more specifics about the project.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kessel John, and I will be your Zoom tech for the evening. Audio is available for this presentation through your computer speakers or by telephone. If you are experiencing technical difficulty with your computer speaker, you can use the phone by clicking on the upward arrow next to your audio settings icon on your Zoom control panel, hitting the arrow, and then choosing switch to phone audio. You would then follow the instructions provided. You will have the ability to give verbal comments after the presentations. However, we are asking people to mute themselves when they are not speaking in order to preserve audio quality. If you have a question during the presentation, you can either type it into the chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom control panel, or you can raise your hand. This is indicated by the little hand sign, and I will give you the ability to unmute yourself, and then you can speak. If you have any tech Zoom issues, please contact me via the chat, and I will help troubleshoot with you. And that is it for Zoom housekeeping, so I will turn it back over to Jane.
Thank you. So tonight we're going to go through some welcome and introductions from myself and the team at ERG right now, before we're diving into the project background and the purpose, which I'll walk you through. And then, as I mentioned, I'll turn it over at that point to Melanie Sands, who's will introduce herself further in a minute, but works with the ERG team on the project. We'll have an opportunity for some Q&A and discussion, and then wrap up to let you know what's next and how you can stay further engaged in the work. So before we jump in, I'm Jane Lazorchek. I lead the Climate Action Office in the Agency of Natural Resources, which is responsible for the development of this tool that you'll be learning about tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Melanie, who will introduce herself and the rest of the ERG team tonight.
Great. Thanks, Jane. Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie Sands. I'm a senior social scientist at Eastern Research Group. As we refer to ourselves as ERG, you'll hear that throughout the presentation this evening. And I'm joined by several of my colleagues. We're all working on this project together, some of whom will be speaking and we'll hear from later in the presentation, and some who will be later in the day. My speaking skills go a little bit, so sorry about that. We'll be looping everyone else in as we get to question and answer and discussion toward the end of the presentation. So for now, I will go ahead and ERG team, we can just popcorn around. Also just noting that we can have Kat introduce herself as well, but she is in the car. So if we don't hear from her, just a heads up to everyone else, she's just listening in for this portion. So at this time, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Lindy to introduce herself.
Sure. Thanks, Melanie. Thanks for joining, everyone. My name is Lindy Lowe, and I am the Director of Climate and Hazard Resilience for ERG. Nicole?
Hello, everyone. Nicole Williams, Environmental Justice Outreach and Research Analyst. I'm going to turn it over to Kat.
Hi, Hi, everyone. I'm Kat Flick. I'm a research analyst with ERG. I am in the car, so I apologize for any background noise, but thanks everyone for being here. And I will pass it. I can't quite see everyone else on the screen, but I'll go back to Mel.
Okay.
Thanks, Kat. I think that's everyone on the ERG side, so we can go ahead and turn it back to Jane to kick us off with the project background and purpose.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So I want to start with some background around the overarching climate law in the state of Vermont and how this project specifically fits into that. In 2020, Vermont passed the Global Warming Solutions Act. That law developed a framework and the ambitious requirements around climate action for the state of Vermont. It speaks to how we as a state will take what were goals that had been on the books for more than a decade around emissions reductions and meet those as statutory obligations. It also goes further to think about and address all of the roles of climate action beyond just cutting climate pollution, and thinks about the objectives of increasing carbon sequestration through the investment in our natural and working lands, as well as building resilience and expanding adaptation to a changing climate in Vermont, and really sets a framework for how to incorporate equity and engagement as foundational components of all of these requirements of the law. Next slide, please. So the framework and the work as we started once the law was passed in 2020 really looked very closely at how to advance the climate action plan, which was required by the Climate Council. So the GWSA is the law, it's the framework. It stood up a Climate Council, which is independent from state government. It's a 23-member body, of which 8 key administration officials, secretaries of my agency, Natural Resources, secretaries of Transportation, and Agency of Commerce and Community Development and Ag, all sit on that council as the 8 administration officials touching most of climate action for the state. But then there's also 15 legislative appointments who represent various sectors that have an influence and responsibility around climate action. So farm and forest reps, environmental organization reps, utility reps, manufacturing and fuel dealers, just to name a few. That Climate Council was stood up rather quickly with appointments or administration officials and began work in earnest to adopt the initial climate action plan that was required by December 1st of 2021. That plan was the first place where we started to talk about how to meet the objectives of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and actually put forward a framework that was the foundation for the work that we're now doing to build the measuring and assessing progress tool. That framework was part of the initial analysis and technical work supported for that climate action plan, and really laid out a process and foundation for what became the RFP, and then ultimately this contract that we're now in phase 1 of, that ERG will speak more directly to in a few minutes. Just want to note that that climate action plan is required to be updated every 4 years. For some reason, the infinite wisdom of the legislature changed the due date from December to July 1st going forward. And so that next plan, our second plan, is actually due 3.5 years from the first plan. And we're in the process of working most earnest on that right now. At the end, you'll have an opportunity to see where our website is, so you can tune in to those public meetings where they're discussing and considering recommendations. And there'll also be a real opportunity later this spring where we go out to the public in very concerted ways to hear from you about what those recommendations might look like. So all of this work fits together around broad climate solutions and how we communicate that work with the public. Next slide. So the Global Warming Solutions Act, as I alluded to, and was referenced in that initial plan that was a requirement of the GWSA, spoke to this tool specifically and requires the state to track key components related to climate action. So The legal backstop around those emissions reductions requirements is what we call the greenhouse gas inventory and forecast that our office produces annually. But that's a very coarse scale of all the contributing factors of like the sale of fossil fuel, high global warming producing refrigerants, et cetera. We track all of that in the inventory, and that's the legal mechanism, the backstop to the law. But we know that there are policy levers that we can pull on and look at to actually realize emissions reductions. In addition, the law speaks to the fact that mitigation isn't the only component of climate action, and we need to address and think about metrics for tracking resilience, sequestration and storage, biodiversity it speaks to, as well as equity and engagement. So we went out and developed a framework, as I alluded to in that first climate action plan, that ultimately led to a plan to how we would develop this tool. And we're here now in phase 1 of really gathering and thinking about what we want to track and what is most important to Vermonters to how we assess progress and speak to that further with all of you. Next slide. The goal of this project is really foundational for the tool development. So this phase of the project is actually not building the tool, but really planning for how we want to track it, how we want to speak to climate action, what the data is that exists, and how we link it to some of those recommendations and goals from other state climate plans. So the state climate action plan, the comprehensive energy plan, the state hazard mitigation plan. What are all those priorities and how do they add up to speak to Vermont's goals for addressing climate change? So we're thinking about how the tool might be used and by whom, decision makers, Vermonters, policymakers, et cetera, what activities should be measured, how those activities should be measured, those metrics that speak to those measures, and then what's available. And we don't want to be limited by data that's available. We want to think pie in the sky, but we also want to be practical about how we can maintain and update the tool over time. So we're in phase 1, as I mentioned. This phase 1 will transition in the spring, summer into building the tool through state government resources. And we want to make sure today with all of you that the work that we're doing is really setting us up for success in that space. Next slide. And now I'm going to turn it over to Melanie Sands, who introduced herself as the project manager, to really walk us through the details of the project today and hear from you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jane. So to just give a little bit more of an overview of the project itself that we're in, that James describing the groundwork and the context for. Here we're going to walk through a little bit of just the overarching timeline and different tasks within the project that we're involved in. So in October, we kicked off the project and we really started with this first piece that's labeled as data governance here, but that's really the task name. There were several things that we did under this first portion of the project. And one of those things is really taking a look at existing resources and tools that would inform the development of this tool. So looking at what kinds of climate measurement tools and climate action tools are other states using or other agencies within Vermont. What kinds of information do those tools contain? What kind of data are they using? So getting a sense of what's out there, and then also taking note of what kinds of tools are we finding very user-friendly or features we like. So just wrapping our heads around what exists, what information is available, what are other folks doing, what do we find helpful. And so we looked across a number of tools and shared that out with the state team, taking stock of some of the basic review of existing resources, tools, and data. And then one of the other things we did within that time frame is we really started getting a group of folks from different state agencies together that will serve as what we're referring to as our data governance team for this project. And that group of people will really help guide the development and management of data for the tool as we move along. So really getting that group together. And again, that's from different agencies, a lot of agencies that will have data that will contribute heavily or be used in the tool sit on that group. And so getting that group together so that as we develop the process and understanding around what data will be used, how will that data be managed, not just in this phase of the project that we're talking about right now, but as the tool is developed and beyond. So that group will will be held over from this phase of the project and be ongoing to manage the data that goes along with this tool moving forward. So after we comprised that group, that's ongoing throughout the course of the project, and also we'll be working with them to develop. We've developed a draft plan of how that data will be managed, but that is also going to evolve as we describe later. We'll in the process as we develop what data sources we'll be using and a better idea of where those data sources are coming from and how we might best manage them. So after we got those couple of pieces in place, as we headed into winter, into December, we started really taking stock, or a more, I would say, comprehensive and consistent approach to thinking about what are we going to measure in the tool and how are we going to measure it. And under this task, it's really labeled as logic models and metrics. So determining some of those things that Jane was mentioning. Who's going to be using the tool? What are we going to measure? How are we going to measure it? And in that, starting to consider what data is available for use in the tool. And we'll be getting into discussion around that and describing that a bit more as we get later into the presentation. But as a high level, coming into winter, we're consistently making those draft priorities for the tool and what those priorities, how they will be measured. So then heading into January into March, the phase we're in now is labeled as our data mapping task. And really it's kind of this seamless flow across tasks in that they're not just distinct silos. So we're going to continue to refine what we're measuring and how we're measuring it through engagement such as this meeting and some other engagement that I'll talk about here in a minute. But we're going to continue to refine what we're measuring, how we're measuring it, and we're really going to start digging into identifying the data sources. What data is available? Where are there data gaps? Where might we want to recommend strategies for future data collections for consideration for future tool development? Things like that. So data is going to be coming up a larger focus as we head into March. And then as we head into spring and early summer, we're going to be wrapping all of that information together. And we're going to make some recommendations for the future tool development. So basically taking everything we have learned throughout this project and compiling it, synthesizing it, and putting forth a summary of the work we did, but also what do we recommend? What have we learned? What do we think should be considered for the future tool development? And then lastly is engagement. And we put this at the bottom because it runs throughout the course of this project. And so there are different types of groups we're engaging along the way. One group is the public. So everyone on this call and this meeting. So having some public input through public meetings, both now, and then we'll have another public meeting toward the end of the project to report out those recommendations. And we'll recap that in our next steps at the end of the presentation today. But we'll be hearing from, or trying to gather input from the public, and also just provide an update and educate people on the tool development process. What are we even doing? Making people aware and gathering input. We're getting input from different state partner agencies who are working with the data and can inform tool development, because we want to learn from people who are using that data, who are developing similar tools. We want to take advantage of all of that wisdom as we build this tool. And then also we're engaging with community-based organizations who work with populations who might be disproportionately impacted by climate change. So hearing directly from those organizations and their constituents about what they would like to see reflected in the tool as well. Next slide, please. So here we are getting ready to take a look at a couple of examples of the type of climate tools or assessing progress tools that we're even talking about here. So I know we're saying mapping tool, or the measuring and assessing progress tool, and a climate action tool. So just to kind of give you a frame of reference of the type of tools we're even talking about here, because again, it's yet to be designed. We're just thinking about what should it measure, how should it measure, those things. But just to give you a little bit of a frame of reference for the style of tool that we're talking about, we're going to walk through just a couple of examples of other tools, just so you have an understanding of what we're even talking about, ballpark reference or contextual understanding. So first is the Lake Tahoe Climate Resilience Dashboard, for those of you who are able to see your screen. On the left-hand side, one of the interfaces that you would see if you're looking at the tool in real life is that it basically takes the goals of their climate resilience action strategy. They have 4 different goals, and then you can, for each of those 4 goals, you can click on subtopics to see what activities are being completed that align with their broader strategies and goals. So for instance, under goal number 2, support a resilient environment, you could click on forest resilience and wildfire risk. And then again, for those of you who might be able to see the PowerPoint screen right now, on the right-hand side of the screen, up would come some information that shows, for example, one thing that they're measuring or tracking is acres of forest being treated to mitigate wildfires. And then, so there's some information that would pop up around the topic, and then there's some additional data links that you can click on to get more granular information or information on the source data that underlies some of the high-level visuals that they're showing. So that's one example of a style tool. So it's showing a strategy, it's showing what are the goals, and then it's showing some information of the actions and how they're tracking those actions toward achieving those goals. Another example of a style of climate action tracking tool that could be relevant here is on the next slide. Oh, great. Kessel's right with me on the on the slide change up. Thanks, Kessel. Is the California Climate Dashboard. And on the California Climate Dashboard, it's a slightly different layout. It's designed to be really directed toward the public and very user-friendly. It's divided, for those of you who can see your screen, into various sectors that you can click on to learn more about what is being measured for each of those. So for instance, you might click on transportation or energy. And if you were to click on energy, then you might see some of the metrics or how they're tracking or measuring their climate action progress in the energy sector on the right-hand side of your screen. So again, just showing out some of their progress made through numbers or metrics. And then in addition to those high-level figures that they provide, again, they provide different resources and links that people can click on to get more granular information. So it provides sector level information, high level snapshot information, but then it allows you to kind of dig in and get into the weeds a little bit more if that's something that is of interest to you. Okay, next slide, please. So now that we have hopefully given you a little bit of an idea of the type of climate action tracking tools that we're aiming for in the tool development phase and where we might be headed with this information, we're going to get a little bit more into the content and overview of this measuring and assessing progress tool that we're in the process of developing under this project and subsequent phases. Next slide, please. So when we think about the tool, we had to consider who are going to be the users of the tool. And of course, we would like the tool to be useful for as many people as possible. So one of the things we had to do is think of, okay, who are going to be the primary and secondary users, if you will. So how are we going to prioritize users and the tool use is another way I guess I could say that. And so in working with the state team, it was determined that the primary tool users will be the Agency of Natural Resources and other state agencies. And the primary uses for the tool are bulleted also on this screen. And the very top priority uses are reporting and communications and demonstrating climate action progress. But also very important and other considerations and uses that will be looped into the tool will be decision-making, information available in the tool will help inform decisions by understanding what climate action is occurring and how that is creating different impacts. Jane talked about those levers that you can pull So what levers are creating change within the climate action and the climate action progress. Also, the tool can be used for planning and programming in that way. And last but not least, these are in no particular order, by the way, of those bottom three, public education and outreach. So we want to help hopefully make the tool very informative to the public as well. Next slide, please. In addition to this, to ANR and other state agencies, the goal is really to design the tool so that we can have it be helpful to as many user groups as possible. So that includes groups like the public, everyone on this call, state legislators, climate council members that Jane mentioned previously, and community-based organizations. So the overarching aim is going to be to provide or create a tool that has granular data that agencies need for their reporting purposes, but present that information in a way that's understandable to the public and other user groups. So some of those tool examples we looked at, for instance, they presented high-level information that people could get a glimpse or a snapshot of information, but could also dig deeper and get behind the scenes or more in the weeds. If you needed more granular information, that could be accessible to you as well. Next slide, please. So the tool will track progress on climate action in Vermont across a range of what we're referring to as sectors, or you could think of them as topic areas, if you will. And you can see those listed here for those of you who can see your screen. They're transportation, buildings and thermal energy, electricity, natural resources, the built environment, response and recovery, and equity and engagement. And we're going to get into a little bit more of these sector areas in a bit. I do want to mention that these are our preliminary ways of binning the climate priorities that we're going to measure. And this could always evolve as that information evolves. And secondly, I wanted to mention that while we're thinking of the top set of bullets as standalone sectors, for example, even though they might be divvied up a little differently over time, the equity and engagement, rather being a standalone sector, excuse me, is actually that topic area. It is woven throughout the other sectors or topic areas. So we'll see that a little bit as we discuss our climate priorities in upcoming slides, but just to acknowledge that that topic is really woven throughout the other topic areas. Next slide, please. And so in developing our priorities and metrics that are going to be contained and measured in the tool, we did a few things. We really first looked at the strategies and actions that are contained in existing Vermont plans. So we first synthesized, the priorities and strategies from plans listed on your screen here. So the 2021 Climate Action Plan, the 2023 State Hazard Mitigation Plan, the 2022 Comprehensive Energy Plan, and then additional plans that have been suggested by other state agencies, those data governance team members. So again, looking across other plans that really help lay out Vermont's climate action strategies and priorities. And so in looking across those plans and pulling out the strategies and actions and priorities from all of them, what we then did is we developed a synthesized and rolled up set of priorities, recommendations, goals, strategies to help guide the development of the metrics that we're going to be using in the tool. So instead of measuring each priority and recommendation from each plan, we're really rolling them up to kind of higher level priorities or topic areas, almost theme kind of priorities, if you think about that way, that resonate across those plans. And the reason why we're doing that is we're thinking ahead about what the tool will measure, those types of high level climate actions or climate action priorities. We want those to stay consistent over time. And then maybe some of the details of the activities that roll up or feed into those priorities, the various actions that may change over time, those can change, but those high level priorities, those themes across plans would be consistent and a little bit higher level. So we're going to be talking about priorities here in a minute, but just knowing that we did try to look across plans and then look for the priorities that are theme priorities and roll those up to high level priorities that will hopefully stay evergreen or consistent over time for the tool as we look for how we can measure progress over time. Next slide, please. So at this time, I am going to go ahead and turn things over to my colleague Lindy, and Lindy is going to walk us through some of the priorities for the different sectors that we just described for the tool. So with that, Lindy, I will turn it over to you to walk through some priorities.
Sure. Thank you, Melanie, for that introduction. And we will walk through the sectors, as Melanie said. These are not static, and we're already looking at, based on input that we've received, some changes and shifts, including potentially adding public health. We will talk briefly about a sector that we just recently added that will probably fill out a little bit more at the end of this. But I'll go through this and point out any changes that we have made or will be making as I go through. I'm going to start with the transportation sector priorities. And as Melanie said, many of these priorities include equity issues, as well as ultimately will be measured. We will recommend how to measure engagement on these priorities, but for now, I'll highlight where equity comes in. Decreased greenhouse gas and other vehicle-based emissions from the transportation sector. Reduce transportation energy burden, an average percentage of household income spent on transportation. This is one that has equity dimensions to it. Increase transportation choices by expanding access to public transportation, active transportation, and shared mobility services. This is one that we think is both mitigation as well as resilience, and definitely has equity components to it. Improve resilience of Vermont's transportation system and reduce vulnerability of roads and bridges to all hazards. Next slide. For building and thermal energy sector priorities, we have reduced greenhouse gas emissions from the buildings and thermal energy sector, reduce thermal energy burden, an average percentage of household income spent on heating and cooling, develop design and construction standards to improve the resilience of buildings to extreme weather and other climate events. Next slide. The electricity sector priorities include protect critical infrastructure and improve resilience in Vermont's electric system. Reduce electricity energy burden, the average percentage of household income spent on electricity, and then reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector, which I'm going to take a moment to describe the process that we developed. And earlier, I believe Melanie talked a little bit about, or it may be presented a little bit later in the presentation, but I think it was earlier, that we developed logic models. And this priority, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector, is a very big bucket. And the inputs to that bucket are the actions that we're finding in many of the plans that we're reviewing. So this is something that, as Melanie said, got rolled up from a large number of actions that are going on in the electricity sector to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. And then for each one of those, or a collection of those inputs, we've identified metrics. And we have an example a little bit later in the presentation about sort of some of the metrics that we developed for one of these priorities. Next slide. The natural and working land sector priorities. And I'll highlight here that this is a place where we may be splitting the natural lands and the ecological elements from the agricultural and working lands, but for now we have them combined. The priorities include reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural and forestry operations, increase carbon sequestration in forests and on agricultural lands, conserve and enhance natural and working lands and ecosystem services, improve resilience of Vermont's ecosystems, managed forests and farms, and the people and businesses that rely upon them to climate hazards. And we have here the 4 that have been identified as some of the most significant in Vermont by the State Hazard Mitigation Plan. Support and enhance local agricultural markets and consumption of local foods, and expand education, technical assistance, and research to improve resilience of natural and working lands. Next slide. The built environment priorities, we have them split into 2. This is the climate resilience slide, and then I will talk about the climate mitigation slide next, or priorities next. Enhance the resilience of Vermont's built environment, communities, infrastructure, buildings, and cultural assets to climate hazards. And these are, again, the ones that were identified by the State Hazard Mitigation Plan as being most likely and most consequential. Design climate actions to benefit the environment, improve conditions for people and disproportionately impacted populations, and reduce risks in the built environment. Incentivize climate resilient land use practices, ensure that all people have access to safe, accessible, energy efficient, and affordable housing. Next slide. And then for the climate pollution reduction priorities, greenhouse gas emissions reduction priorities, increase energy efficiency and energy performance of residential and commercial buildings, reduce energy use in buildings by at least 25% through cost-effective and affordable weatherization and energy efficient improvements, as well as through use and enforcement of energy codes. And this is one in which you could actually address climate resilience, climate mitigation, and equity considerations. Reduce emissions associated with land use through zoning, siting, design, and development standards and building codes. Increase carbon sequestration and storage opportunities in Vermont's built environment. Reduce building-related carbon emissions by reducing the carbon content of the fuels they use, and reduce emissions from industrial and technological sectors. Next slide. And then this was one that we just recently added based on conversations that we have had with folks throughout Vermont and some of Vermont's state agencies, and that's the response and recovery sector priorities. It's very early stages for these priorities, and these will likely shift and change a bit. But for now, we have ensure roads and bridges return to normal operations in a timely manner after damage, and then reduce length of power outages. Next slide. So the way in which we are developing the metrics that will measure the progress on those priorities is that we are using our understanding of data availability, of the directness and clarity of the metrics. If you're a member of the public and you open this tool, do you understand this metric? Is it clear to you? Is it clear that it connects to the priority that we've attached it to? That's what we mean by directness and clarity. Relevance of the metric to future Vermont plans, and Melanie's talked about that. We want something that is evergreen, that as Vermont updates their climate action plan, as climate resilience plans come online, the things that are being measured now will continue to be measured. Even if actions shift a bit, those priorities will stay very similar because they're higher level and rolled up, and the metrics will be metrics that will be fairly stable. And then impact of the action being measured on meeting Vermont's climate goals. So we want to have metrics that people can see as, this is something that I understand how it's having an impact on Vermont's climate goals, And the things that we're measuring are those things that are most likely to have a big enough impact to be noticed and measured. Next slide. So this is an example of the metrics that we're using for one of the priorities. And as you might remember, I presented in transportation the priority of improving resilience of Vermont's transportation system and reducing the vulnerability of roads and bridges. Some of the metrics that we've identified that could be used for this are number of road closures per year, average length of road closure in rural and non-rural areas, number of culverts replaced, number of transportation resilience improvement projects completed, the number or the dollars, the amount of money of disaster assistance, and we're going to change from FEMA to period, disaster resistance that's provided by the state or the feds or somebody else entirely. Acres of land conserved for headwater and floodplain storage, and the number of mobile homes relocated from flood vulnerable locations. And you'll also notice in these metrics that we've identified that have that impact this priority, they're from a range of different sectors. And we do see this as ultimately when we select the metrics and we settle on a set of priorities, there will be stories we're going to want to tell about those priorities and how acting in a number of different sectors can improve the outcomes on those priorities. Next slide. So our next steps will be to finalize the metrics that we're going to use to measure progress on Vermont's priorities, as well as finalizing the priorities and ensuring that we get the right set of bins or sectors or issues. So those will be the things we're doing over the next month. And then we will also be identifying the best data sources for the metrics that we select. Thanks. And for folks, I'm going to pass it on to Melanie, but if anyone has any questions before we move on.
Yeah, I think at this time we can just open it up to questions on anything we've covered so far. You can feel free to drop a question in the chat. You could also raise your hand and Kessel can unmute you and you can ask your question, but we would welcome any questions that you have so far and we can address those before we move on. It's like there may not be any so far. We're going to move on to an activity to get some input, but just flagging that if you do have questions that arise throughout the remainder of the conversation, you can put those in the chat and we can also address them later. So just don't hesitate because it's a lot of information we've thrown at you and we're happy to answer any question. No question too small or too big. So I'll just position it that way. So yeah, okay. And with that, we will continue to look for questions, but in the near term, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nicole, who is going to lead us through an activity to hopefully get some input from all of you about your thoughts on some of these priorities.
Great, thank you, Melanie. We're now going to transition to an interactive activity where we're going to answer 2 questions. We're going to use an interactive presentation tool called Mentimeter. So you can either scan the QR code on your phone that is on the screen, or you can type in menti.com. Once you type that in, you can type in the code 878-50739. So I'm going to wait a minute for everyone to join.
In addition, I just noticed that Kessel also put the link directly in the chat. So if you prefer that, you can go to the chat and you can click on the link and that will take you there as well.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, please, if you're unable to do so, you can message me.
I will also
And
just, oh, go ahead, Nicole.
oh, nope, go ahead.
I was just
You're
going
fine.
to say, if you happen to be joining mostly on audio or unable to do an interactive activity, you can also, we can ask for additional comments at the end and we can unmute you. You could also just place thoughts as we go along into the chat if that ends up being preferable to you.
Yep, great, thank you. So we have about 20 minutes for this activity, 10 minutes per question. So I'm going to assume that everybody has logged on. So the first question that we would like for you to answer is, do the priorities that we described match the priorities for you and your community's climate priorities? If not, please list any that you might have. And so you can go ahead and type your answers in the box. Short answers are preferred, and you can submit multiple responses. Once people start responding, their answers to the questions will appear on everyone's slides. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute or add your question to the chat.
I'll also just add that I know we went through a lot of priorities. And so please don't be hesitant of, I don't know if that priority was mentioned or not. You could also just think about what priorities are important to you and feel like you can go ahead and list those. And we, on our end, we can always compare and pull out anything that might already be listed. So if that's preventing you from contributing, please don't let it. Just feel free to list any climate priorities that you may have.
I think one thing we heard this morning in the meeting that we had made us rethink a few things, and that had to do with more directly talking about public health priorities related to climate change. And so, you know, it could be a big broad category like that. The person who made that comment did acknowledge that we had public health kind of scattered throughout, but thought it was important to highlight it as a priority. And it looks like somebody has a comment here, Nicole.
Yep, I see that. Thank you. Someone responded, I have trouble separating climate from environmental health. Would like to see pesticide data included and reduction of chemicals used in Vermont. Great, thank you for that feedback. We
And
really
I think
appreciate
just
it.
to touch on that comment a little bit, I think whether it's the overlap between climate and environmental health, or like Lenny was mentioning, climate and public health, I think a lot of these issues do overlap. And so I think that's a very valid point and something that I think that's on our radar of how a lot of these issues intersect.
Also, if anyone, again, wants to put their comments in the chat or raise your hand, you can do that as well. I think I'll give it another 2 minutes and then we'll move to the next question. Oh, we have another comment that says related. PFAS used in so many products, including solar panels. So tracking locations and specifications of what's in the products being put in the environment would be good to track.
And I think one thing that comment makes me think of is that, and I think we probably articulated this, but I'm not sure if we did it in a straightforward fashion, in that we're laying the groundwork for this tool, and then there will be a first iteration of the tool that will be developed. But information, while those priorities, the aim is to have those priorities the same over time, we'll be able to maybe integrate different types of information or data sources where we had gaps before. So I think we could have very layered information over time. And so it just made me think of, you know, to this comment of what are the climate actions, but then also as we consider different actions and their impacts, and some more nuanced information over time, the tool will probably continue to evolve in what is being tracked in the tool.
Thanks, Melanie. So we have another comment, and it says, also related to environmental health, the chemicals used in water disinfection, and as climate changes, the challenges may result in more chemical usage. It would be good to track those numbers. Great. Okay, so I think we can move on to the second question. All right, so the second question asks, are there any climate-related resources or tools you have used that you have found helpful? So you can do the same thing with this question. Use Mentimeter, raise your hand, or put your comments in the chat.
And here, I think I'd just like to add that when we're thinking about that or wanting to understand from you, it could be content that you find. So resources, the information contained in the resource is really helpful to you. It could be the resource is helpful to you because it's user friendly or the way you can access it or actually use the tool. So I think we can think of this pretty broadly. So however that resonates with you, whether it's content, user functions, anything of that nature. So just wanted to mention that we could think about it in whatever way is meaningful to you when you think about resources or tools that you may have found helpful.
Great. Yep, thanks for clarifying that. And we'll give folks a few minutes to answer that question. So our first comment says Vermont has some really great mapping tools. After the floods that hit Bear, Montpelier, Ludlow, a map savvy person produced maps showing elevations, properties, and provided a way to understand. I'll give it another minute. I see we have another comment. Maps that show the flood hazard areas in downtown would be a valuable resource for planners. Yep, that's a great point. Thank you for both of those responses.
I do want to say related to that second comment, as a lot of the team members on this call were also involved in the development of the Vermont Municipal Vulnerability Indicators tool. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. That's a mapping tool. But in that process, I think there is some mapping, whether it's in that tool and some other tools that do show some flooding, and you can overlay towns with flood information and different I want to say historical levels of flooding. That's probably not the technical way to say it. But I just want to mention that we'll definitely note that for this tool, but also just it could be something if it's of interest to you now and you're looking to maybe use that for your purposes or better understand. I think that you can find it in some other tools. I will put the name of the Municipal Vulnerability Indicators tool into the chat as well, if that's information that you're seeking in the near term.
Great, thank you. Looks like we don't have any more comments or feedback. So thank you for both of those responses. I think we can now go to our last question. Oh, that was you, Melanie, that put that in there. Okay. Now we can go to, I thought that was another chat or comment. Now we can go to our last question. Kessel, if you would like to pull up the poll. So we have a final poll that we would like for you to respond to. On a scale from 1 to 5, how likely are you to use the type of information presented in the tool? 1 is extremely unlikely and 5 is extremely likely. So I will give everyone a few minutes to answer this question. And it looks like we have gotten responses from both attendees. One person said likely and the other person said extremely likely. So thank you for doing that for us. Thank you for that feedback. So we can go to the next slide and I will turn it over to Melanie, who will go over some next steps.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. And thank you everybody who participated in those activities. I know with a smaller group, it can sometimes feel a little intimidating, but we also are going to be offering up here in our next steps another mechanism for you or others that you know to provide input as well. So you'll have another chance if you'd like to provide information in a different way. But as you can see in our next steps, I'm first going to touch on this timeline for the project in the table at the bottom of the screen for you, for those of you who are able to see the screen. And it's really some information that we've touched on a little bit throughout. So today, January, end of January, are our public meetings. So we had one earlier today and then this one. So thank you for attending. This meeting is being recorded and the recordings will be available. So if you would like to share it with others that you think would find it interesting or informative, please feel free to share that when that becomes available to you. In February, we're also going to be doing our engagement with the community-based organizations. So that is coming up here rapidly. And then some of the next steps that Lindy mentioned and that we're going to, as we come through early winter into spring, we're going to be continuing to refine the tool priorities and metrics, how those sectors or bins are divided, and really focus in on the data that is available and or missing and what data is missing and that we want to highlight those gaps as well. So thinking about data and pulling that all together. As we head into May and June, we'll then be pulling together and synthesizing everything we learned throughout this project. And we'll have another public meeting. We'll share out the link to that will share our findings and our recommendations for the forthcoming tool. So hopefully we will see you all again there. And you can see the evolution of the tool and the priorities and our recommendations moving forward for the tool. So the other thing that I wanted to touch on in terms of next steps, I'm going to put a link in the chat. And this is a link to a form questionnaire. So it's really just asking for additional input about your thoughts around the priorities and the tool use. Some of those topics we touched on in our activity, but if you'd like to provide additional information or more detailed information, it's another way for you to do that. In addition, if you pass along the presentation to anyone, others can fill out this form as well, because it's really trying to, again, get your input in as to the priorities that you want to see reflected in this tool, so that we're trying to make it helpful to you and think about how people will use it moving forward. So we are collecting that information through that questionnaire through Friday of next week, the 7th. So hopefully, if that's something of interest to you, we'd be happy to have your input, because your input really does matter. And we do consider everything that we're hearing through all of these different types of engagement as we continue to refine and develop the content of the tool. So I think that is all that we had on our end to present. We really thank you for your time, making time in the evening to join and learn about this tool and provide your thoughts and feedback. Anything that you would like to say, Jane, before we close out?
No, just appreciate all the work that's gone into this, and appreciate even the few of you who are able to join tonight being here. Hearing from Vermonters is the most important part about all these tools and goals and recommendations. So thank you for the time.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.